are beginning the third of our more or less 5 to 6 lecture components of the course. We're moving into a new phase of the historical development in Ukraine, sometimes called the Polish-Lithuanian period. Actually, it should be more properly called the Lithuanian, Polish, Crimean period, and as we're going to see. And today, this first phase, or this first lecture of the 5 on this era in Ukrainian history, deals with specifically Lithuania and its relationship to Poland. Now, during the 13th century, which we were looking at last time when discussing the Rus Principality Kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia, at the very same time that the Rus Kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia had reached its height in political, economic, and cultural influence, especially during the reigns of Danilo and his son Lev, which I think accounted for most of the second half of the 1200s, the 13th century. At the same time that that was going on, a new state on the Eastern European horizon was before long to have a decisive impact on the history of Ukraine, and that state was Lithuania. Now, Lithuania, or more precisely, formerly the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, it began its rise to power after a local ruler named Mindaugas, and I put his name here as well as you can see on the chart, ruling more or less as a contemporary of Danilo in Galicia-Volhynia. He succeeded in uniting several Lithuanian tribes into a kind of confederation during the 1230s and early 1240s. Now, who were these Lithuanians? Well, they were a Baltic people, Indo-Europeans, closely related to the Slavs. Sometimes one speaks of Baltic Slavic peoples. They had lived ever since prehistoric times along the eastern coast of the Baltic Sea and along the swampy areas, lowland areas of 2 rivers, the Neman River and the western Dwina River. These Lithuanian tribes were known to the neighboring East Slavic tribal groups, who eventually became part of the Rus Federation headed in Kiev. But the various Lithuanian tribal groups remained outside the orbit of Rus political and therefore a cultural framework. And in terms of the cultural framework, they did not become Christian. They remained pagans until quite late. Now, while the Rus princes, beginning way back with the expansion period in the history of Rus, the 10th century, Vladimir I, the Great, fought from time to time against Lithuanian tribes, in particular against one known as the Latvigians. These are one of many of these Lithuanian tribal groups. So there was interaction between the Rus, in particular Volodymyr, from the east. But the first real threat to the Lithuanians did not come from the east, but came from the west. During the first half of the 13th century, the 1200s, a Roman Catholic Polish duke from the area of Mazovia, which is around, it's in the center of present-day Poland, really the area around its capital, Warsaw, subsequent capital. This Polish Roman Catholic duke felt threatened by another Baltic people neighboring to the Lithuanians, the Prussians, also non-Christian pagan Prussians. We tend to associate Prussians with the Germanic world. Well, they were actually originally a Baltic tribe that later, well, we'll see what happened. You adopt the names of those who you conquer. We've seen that with the Polovtsians, for example. In any case, the Poles are concerned about these Baltic Prussians, and they invite German knights and other adventurers returning from the Crusades. I mean, the medieval period was the era of the Crusades. Several hundreds of thousands of Christian leaders, princes, knights, etc., went to the so-called Holy Land. They eventually had to return. What are they supposed to do? So some of them hire themselves out as mercenary troops. And among them are these German knights returning from the Crusades. And now they, filled with missionary zeal, and they arrive along the shores of the Baltic Sea. These came to be known as the Knights of the Teutonic Order. The Knights of the Teutonic Order. Small group of them, but they came to have control, and they arrived along the Vistula River, settling in a town called Torn, which is in present-day northwestern Poland, not far from the sea, but not on the sea itself either. And there they set up their first stronghold, and filled with all of the fervor that self-righteous religious fanatics want to have, the Teutonic Knights spread Christianity with fire and sword, and within a half a century they had exterminated most of this Prussian Baltic peoples living in that area, which is exactly what that Polish duke wanted to happen. Remember, in the old days when we first taught this course, very popular was a film called, I think it called Star Wars. That's even before your generation. But Dark Vader? Darth Vader. Dark or Darth? Dark. Darth Vader is dressed up in many ways like one of these Teutonic knights from this early era. So, these Teutonic knights get rid of the Prussians. Now they are ready to turn to those next heathens that are on to the east and north of Christian Poland, that is the Lithuanians. And in many ways, they already had the Lithuanians almost surrounded. Since as early as 1202, even before they came there, another group of German knights, known as the Germanic knights, known as the Order of the Brothers of the Sword, came into existence in Livonia, present-day Latvia. And there they now, in a sense, Poland was surrounded north and the west by these Germanic knights. In fact, in 1237, these knights became the Livonian branch of the Teutonic Knights. And so it was this threat posed by the Teutonic Knights in the west and the Livonian Knights in the north that prompted the Lithuanians or the Lithuanian tribes, to now settle some of their differences and to unite under this Mindaugas. So that's the context of how Mindaugas was able to bring them together and then to expand toward the south and east. They couldn't go north, they couldn't go west because of the Teutonic Knights. So their only way to expand is to go east. And that brought them into conflict with the Rus princes of the Rus Principality of Polotsk, just to the north, also with the Poles to the south and directly to the south into conflict with Danilo of Galicia, Volhynia. Somewhat like Daniel of Galicia, Volhynia, this Mindaugas negotiated with the Vatican, but even went one step further than Daniel. This Mindaugas, converted to Roman Catholicism and received a crown in 1251. This politically inspired act, as a result, now he's Christian, and so that brought peace with the Teutonic and Livonian Knights, because there's no more reason, theoretically, because then the leader, at least, is not pagan. Even though, so Mindaugas accepted Christianity, but not the mass of the Lithuanians. They remained pagan. However, that move allowed Mindaugas to direct his attention further southward. But there he was confronted with the powerful Daniel of Galicia, who through military force, through diplomatic alliances, dynastic marriages, as we saw when we discussed Galicia, Volhynia, Danilo was able to keep Mindaugas from achieving at least one of his goals, and that was the acquisition of the province immediately to the south called Volhynia. So Lithuanians are still held at bay. Also at this time, further decline of the southern Rus principalities following the Mongol invasion. It was 1240. Here we are in the second half of the 13th century. And therefore, in the south, created a power vacuum which the successors to Mindaugas were only too anxious to try to fill. And so a southward and eastward expansion was especially remarkable during the reign of another ruler after Mindaugas, a man named Gediminas. Gediminas. You can see his dates on the chart that I handed out. Here we are now in the first half of the 14th century. And it is this Gediminas who acquired the rest of the Polotsk Principality, the Brest and Podlachia regions on the western edge of Volhynia, the Turov-Pinsk Principality, all these Rus principalities. In effect, under Gediminas, most of present-day Belarus was now brought under the rule of the Lithuanians. Gediminas himself even assumed the title King of Lithuania and Rus. Together, King of Lithuania and Rus. Now, after Gediminas died, he had two sons, Algirdas, Kęstutis. They divided the realm between them, but didn't fight necessarily amongst themselves, and together they expanded the boundaries of Lithuania, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, even further. Part of Smolensk Principality here in the north, Chernihiv, the Rus Principality, moving down, Novhorod-Siversky, the Kiev Principality, Pereyaslav Principality, an area called Podolia here. Many of these areas you know, at least Podolia, from your map test. And so in this case, the Lithuanians pushed even farther south, below the Ros River, which always had been that traditional end of the forest steppe region, the traditional southern boundary of the Rus principalities, and then we have the open steppe. Lithuanians continue even further into the open steppe. These same decades also witnessed now a 30-year struggle for the Galician-Volhynian kingdom, beginning in 1340 and ending in 1370, finally when Lithuania annexes Volhynia. So successful were the Lithuanians that in 1362, at a battle called the Blue Waters, down here on the southern Buch River, the Lithuanians defeated the armies of the Mongolo-Tatar Golden Horde. No one had done this until then. This Lithuanian victory at the Battle of Blue Waters clearly initiated a new order in Eastern Europe, an order in which the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was to play, and was going to play, as we're going to see, the dominant role. Put another way, in little over a century since the death of Mindaugas in 1263, under his successors, Gediminas, those two sons of Gediminas, during this century, most of the southern and central principalities of the Rus Federation, much of what is today Belarus and Ukraine, were now under the political hegemony of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Well, what was the secret of this rapid Lithuanian success? Well, most important was the fact that the Lithuanians changed little in the territories which they took over. They changed little. The Rus princes were left to rule in their several patrimonies. The Orthodox faith was left unmolested. In fact, many Lithuanians themselves became Orthodox Christians, although the ruling Grand Ducal family remained pagan. It was only Mindaugas was the exception, so still pagan. And also the laws and the social structure which had prevailed since the days of Kievan Rus were left intact. So we still have Rus law. The Lithuanians even adopted what was called Ruthenian. That is a Belarusian or Ukrainian variant of Church Slavonic, so that their official language was Ruthenian Slavonic, not even Lithuanian. And by carrying out these policies, the Lithuanians were in fact welcomed by most of the Rus princes. Now, also like the rulers of Kievan Rus, the Lithuanian Grand Dukes followed the practice of dividing the realm among their sons. And as we know from the history of medieval Rus, this practice always carried the potential for interprincely warfare. And that occurred among the Lithuanians as well. The first crisis of this sort came after the deaths of the joint rulers, the two sons of Gediminas, Algirdas and Kęstutis. Algirdas and Kęstutis. This is one of the rare times when we're going to do what medieval history is usually about, all of these ruling families, this son, this marriage, and so forth and so on. I've been trying to avoid that, but today we can't avoid it. It's an interesting story, however, and it's going to explain a lot in terms of the subsequent history of Ukraine. So these two rulers, Algirdas and Kęstutis, die relatively close, one in 1377, the other in 1381. And then we have conflict between their sons. Well, why? In particular, it was caused by feuding between those two sons, one called Jogaila and the other Vytautas, so they're cousins in effect. And as a result of this struggle for power between those two, political changes were to occur that, as I said, were to have profound implications not only for the history of Ukraine, but for the history of Eastern Europe as a whole. So how did this play itself out, literally? Well, Jogaila had actually come to power in 1381. Notice the death of his uncle Kęstutis in 1381. Well, he came to power as the main ruler. Why? Because he killed his uncle Kęstutis. And when Kęstutis' son Vytautas saw this, he fled. He fled where? To the old enemy of the Lithuanians, the Teutonic Knights. And he convinces the Teutonic Knights to join him in a campaign against his cousin, Jogaila. Now, Jogaila, fearing this invasion by the Teutonic Knights, he decides to turn to the only other strong power in the region, Poland. But why should Roman Catholic Poland be interested in the plight of this heathen Lithuania, this heathen Lithuanian Jogaila? Well, to answer this question, we must first examine, however briefly, the situation in Poland. Moving back a little bit, the 1000s, the late 11th century, the Polish kingdom came into being under the leadership of rulers from a dynasty known as the Piasts. The Piasts. And under their rule, most of the territory that is within the present-day boundaries of Poland was brought together. These Piasts were not only the first dynasty, for all intents and purposes, they were the creators of Poland. And as a result, the concept of a Polish state and the ruling Piast dynasty was undifferentiated. Piast's success in gathering territories under its rule was challenged, eventually, during this same 13th century that we're talking about. Because at that century, Poland, after having been brought together by the Piasts, now lost a lot of land in the northwest to the Germanic rulers of the Holy Roman Empire. Silesia in the south, they lost to the Kingdom of Bohemia and Moravia. The Baltic lands, of course, in the north and northeast of the Teutonic Knights. And so now Poland itself is surrounded by these now powerful neighbors. Its only outlet was also to go east. And so when the Polish kingdom was revived in the 14th century, it was precisely toward the east that its foreign policies were directed. And under the leadership of a powerful Piast ruler, Casimir, known as Casimir the Great, in the middle of the 14th century, Poland now is revived, signs accords with its only ally in Central Europe, Hungary, taking advantage of the decline of the Galician-Volhynian kingdom after 1340. Poland undertakes a campaign, lasts nearly half a century, although in 1387, Galicia is formally incorporated into the Kingdom of Poland, effectively achieved even earlier at the time of Casimir's death in 1370. And so now we go into the classic medieval story here. Sit back and relax. Casimir had no male heir. So before his death, he chose as his successor his nephew, who happened to be the king of Hungary, a man named Louis of Anjou. Now, Anjou is actually a house that began in France but was ruling southern Italy, the kingdom of two Sicilies, Naples and Sicily. I mentioned this because it was a warm place. And therefore, Louis was not really interested in Poland. It was pretty cold. And so he proposed that the future husband of one of his three daughters should rule in his stead. Now, the point here being that Louis of Anjou, though he derives from the house of Anjou, was the king of Hungary. Now, Hungary is a little bit warmer, but you don't want to go north of those Carpathians where it's cold and breezy, etc. So he doesn't want to go north. So what does he do? He proposes that the future husband of one of his three daughters should rule in his stead. Okay, so now you have to prepare the Polish nobles for his ideas of how to transfer the crown of Poland. And so he calls the Polish nobles to a town in northeastern Hungary called Košice, present-day Slovakia, 1373, 1374. And he tries to convince them to accept his ideas of succession. Okay, he can convince them. However, he was forced to make several concessions to them. What kind of concessions? Well, the Polish nobles demanded, one, renunciation of the king's right to impose upon the nobility any extraordinary levy for troops. So you just can't turn around and say, you know, we're starting a war. You must, because you're knights, and that's your role as part of the aristocracy, supply troops. No, you can't do that. The second thing that they demanded was the exemption for the Polish nobility in perpetuity from having to pay taxes. And this, of course, is the biggest achievement. Also, an agreement that official posts throughout Poland would be held only by nobles who were natives of the province. So you couldn't bring in any foreigners. Because in Hungary, by the way, when Louis of Anjou became king of Hungary, he brought a lot of his retinue and friends from Naples and Sicily. So you couldn't do, the Poles didn't want this. It had to be local. And similarly, only persons of Polish and of non-royal blood, which is another thing, could become the so-called starostas, or the royal governors of the 23 most important castles. Now, these four concessions, known as the Statutes of Košice, because that's that town in northeastern Hungary where they were achieved in 1374, these Statutes of Košice, they set the tone for the future relationship between the kings and nobles in Poland. The Piasts had been the founding and, in a sense, the national dynasty. And their rights to rule, hereditary rights, were never, ever contested. But Casimir turned out to be the last male ruler of the Piasts, and after his death, this traditional fusion of identities between state and the founding Piast dynasty were now broken. All of Casimir's successors, and certainly beginning with the first, were, Louis of Anjou, were considered foreigners. And so the Polish nobles felt they had the right, not only the right, but the duty to negotiate with their future ruler before pledging allegiance to him. This was the birth of that rather unique system of aristocratic democracy, we can call it that, in Poland, whereby the nobility, the large landowning magnates, the gentry, which we're going to see next time subsequently represented in a central diet, the nobility was to play a decisive, sometimes destructive, role in Polish political life. Now, this new king, Louis of Anjou, as you can see on your chart, had 3 daughters. The youngest of these daughters, named Jadwiga, you can see that on your chart. She had been betrothed already, as is typical in the medieval period. She was only 5 years old, and she already was betrothed to a prince, a Habsburg prince in Habsburg, Austria. But the Polish nobles, they were not pleased with having this future Germanic connection. But they did want to have a daughter of Louis as their ruler. So now what to do with this quandary? She's already betrothed to a Habsburg Germanic prince. They do want her, a daughter, so what to do? Well, it's at this point that the Lithuanian heathen Duke Jagiełło enters the picture. Now, you remember, as I just said earlier, the Grand Duchy, Jagiełło's Grand Duchy, was threatened by his cousin Vytautas, who, in alliance with the Teutonic Order, preparing to invade Lithuania. This Jagiełło, impressed now by the strength and prestige of a Poland that in the recent past was ruled by the powerful Casimir the Great, and then Louis of Anjou, Louis of Hungary, and Hungary was a powerful kingdom. So Poland was serious here, looked good. And being themselves now in need of a ruler, Polish nobles accepted negotiators from Lithuania. And through Jadwiga's mother, they convinced this now 11-year-old girl that she must break her marriage vow with the Germanic Habsburg prince, and in the interest of the nation, the 11-year-old girl must marry instead the 37-year-old Lithuanian Jagiełło. Now, for his part of the bargain, Jagiełło had to agree to certain demands made by whom? The ones that are always making demands in Poland, the Polish nobles. And what were those demands? Well, they were incorporated into a document known as the Union of Krewo. Notice we have the Statutes of Košice, and now we have the Union of Krewo, not too long after that, in 1385. In return for Jadwiga's hand in marriage, Jagiełło was to accept Roman Catholicism not only for himself, but for his whole Lithuanian people. And this new Christian monarch now had to have a new name. And he was now crowned Władysław II, maintaining his family name Jagiełło, the Polish form of Jogaila. And so he founds and is the first of a new dynasty in Poland called the Jagiellonian dynasty. This Jagiełło, now as king of Władysław II Jagiełło, had to promise to work for, quote, the recovery of all those territories in Lithuania and the Rus lands which supposedly had once belonged to Poland. And so already at this agreement, or this Union of Krzewo in 1385, the Polish nobles claimed that Poland's patrimony was not only Galicia, which they already obtained, but all the other Belarus and Ukrainian lands of the former Kievan Rus Federation. And here we have the Polish nobles not only reasserting their power vis-a-vis the future king, they also set his foreign policy for him. And they expected him to follow it. Now, after assuming the throne, Jagiełło carried out his side of the bargain. In fact, what began as an opportunistic political move now turned into a situation whereby this converted Lithuanian heathen seemed to have become a true believer. And fulfilling the typical characteristics of many converts, he became, no offense intended, more Catholic than the Pope. Now, while such a policy might have favorable results for the members of the Lithuanian nobility, who just now converted to Roman Catholicism, it was to have very negative repercussions for the vast numbers of the inhabitants living in the Grand Duchy, because most of the inhabitants of this gigantic Grand Duchy were Orthodox Rus, whether modern-day Belarusians or Ukrainians. And almost immediately after taking power, Jagiełło did agree that all the princes of Lithuanian origin, now Roman Catholics, could retain authority over the Rus lands that they ruled, but they could do this only if they pledged themselves vassals of the king. Now, initially, this policy was met by opposition from Jagiełło's brethren in Lithuania that eventually came to be ruled by his cousin, so this Vytautas, that they were in conflict. Now they reach an accord. And as a result of this, Jagiełło, king of Poland, forced to accept several agreements whereby Lithuania was to remain an independent Grand Duchy, ruled by his cousin Vytautas. But the Lithuanians, in turn, agreed to recognize the Jagiellonian claims to the throne of Poland. Now, through all of these actions, this now cousin, also a dynamic ruler himself, trying through political, military, and diplomatic means to make Lithuania the dominant power in Eastern Europe. Now, ultimately, he failed in this attempt, although his successors did succeed in maintaining the independence of Lithuania, while ever more it was being drawn closer and closer to Poland. Now, as for Ukraine, or Ukrainian lands, it was directly affected by this new Polish-Lithuanian relationship, however tenuous it may have been on political grounds. Now, since the Grand Duke Vytautas and his successors remained Roman Catholics, they made appointments primarily to adherents of that religion. And so while the Orthodox Church was allowed to exist, it soon became clear that social and political advancement in the Grand Duchy would be severely limited if one were not Roman Catholic. So this was now the prestige religion. This situation for the Orthodox Rus was particularly difficult in Galicia, which after agreements with Hungary and Lithuania was incorporated fully, as I said, in 1387, now directly into Poland. Several Galician Rus boyars, remember them, how powerful they were, those landowning Orthodox boyars that always blocked the princes of the senior princes in Galicia. They're Orthodox. Now they are forced to leave the area. And they were replaced by whom? By Polish officials and Polish gentry who, together with the Roman Catholic Church, were now awarded large tracts of land in Galicia. So the Roman Catholic presence now increasingly stronger and stronger in Galicia. Now, farther east, with regard to the situation of the Orthodox Rus population under Lithuanian rule in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, it kind of varied throughout the 15th century, and that really depended on the relationship between Poland and Lithuania, these two separate entities. And so whenever a Lithuanian Grand Duke might have intended to use the Orthodox nobility as a source of support for their own separatist inclinations, the Poles would then try to undermine these efforts by granting further rights to the Orthodox Rus. So this went back and forth. And if the Orthodox nobles still felt they were being treated unjustly, they might seek refuge elsewhere. And where was that elsewhere for the Orthodox Rus of Poland, Lithuania, or I should say from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, by fleeing eastward to what was now another Grand Duchy of Muscovy, about which we will speak, but not today. However, to note today, the 1500s, the 1600s, the 16th century, particularly characterized by the emigration of numerous Rus nobility, of Orthodox clergy, townspeople, and even peasants, both from Belarus and Ukraine, who moved from what they considered an oppressive Roman Catholic environment that it was in Lithuania to a more hospitable one in lands under the control of Orthodox Muscovy in the east. This movement of people to the east, as well as Muscovy's expansion westward, led to increasingly frequent conflicts during the 16th century, as a result of which the Grand Duchy of Lithuania started to lose some of its eastern lands. The situation became especially serious during the 1560s because Muscovy was now under the rule of a rather aggressive ruler named Ivan IV, otherwise known as the Dread, the Terrible, etc. Again, we'll speak about that, I think, next time. Point is that faced with this threat, the Lithuanians now turned to the Polish king for military aid. In short, the Lithuanians soon realized the necessity of having to have a closer relationship with Poland. In a very real sense, these attacks from the east, from Muscovy, represented part of a larger struggle between Muscovy on the one hand and Poland on the other, and of course in between is the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Why? Because all of these powers claimed the Rus lands that had formerly been part of the Kievan Rus Federation. To further this goal, the Polish king and leading Polish magnates, now that is the relationship with Lithuania that is demanding closer relationships. So the Polish king and the Polish Lithuanian, the Polish nobility favors the fusion or incorporation of Lithuania, because until then it was only in personal union through the king with Poland. So now what to do in the future? Representatives of both sides meet in 1569 in a town called Lublin. 1569 Lublin, it is in the eastern part of modern-day Poland, almost on the border with modern-day Ukraine. So in 1569 they meet in Lublin. Certain Lithuanian nobles, they were a little bit upset. They didn't want to lose entirely their independence, and so they were opposed to the maximalist or the full incorporation position that the Poles were proposing. So it doesn't work out. Negotiations drag on for several months. Finally, the deadlock's broken when the Polish king just simply and unilaterally orders the incorporation of Lithuanian-ruled Rus lands, that is, the provinces of Volhynia and Kiev, into the Polish kingdom. Just simply takes them. It's interesting to note, by the way, that the local Rus nobility in Volhynia and in the Kiev regions did not oppose this move by the Polish king. In fact, they favored it. So now, faced with the loss of all of its southern regions, Lithuanian nobles agreed to what became known as the Union of Lublin. The Union of Lublin. According to this covenant, this agreement, this union, signed on July 1st, 1569, if you travel to Lublin today, still major monuments, because this was a major achievement. Poland and Lithuania would no longer be simply united in the person of the king, but henceforth there would be a common republic with a king who would be elected by both regions, but represented in one diet, or Sejm, as was known in Polish. So we have one king, one diet, and the king elected by the one diet with representatives from both the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Now, it is true that after Lublin, the Lithuanians did retain their own army, their own treasury, their own law code, still the Rus law code, by the way, but then they started issuing their own local administration. But in subsequent decades, the Grand Duchy's particularities were brought more and more in line with the rest of Poland. In foreign affairs, however, this new state acted from the very outset, after the signing of the Union of Lublin, as a single entity which came to be known as the Common Republic of Two Nations. The Common Republic of Two Nations, Rzeczpospolita Obojga Narodu, or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And so, as a result of these negotiations begun at Lublin in 1569, Poland succeeded in gaining greater control over much of the heritage of medieval Kievan Rus. With regard specifically to the Rus lands in present-day Ukraine, now to the province of Galicia, which Poland already had by 1340s, 1387. Now were added Volhynia and Kiev, including the old Principality of Pereyaslav, all of which were integral parts of the Polish kingdom. And so, the history of Ukraine was to be largely determined by the fate of Poland, or specifically now the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as you can see on that map. Next time we will see how all of this functions and works out. Have a good rest of the day, people.